It was on one such damp and gently whispering autumn morning that Miss Marple observed something quite out of place in her otherwise orderly garden. The mist clung low, curling like pale ribbons across the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, and the grass bore the faint glisten of overnight dew. She had risen early, as was her habit, and wandered out with a cup of weak China tea to inspect the dahlias that had taken rather well to the late season. There, on the hedge bordering the west side of her plot, precisely where the lilacs had long since ceased their bloom, hung a single white glove. It was not caught, nor wind-blown, but placed, draped gently over a protruding branch, as if someone had paused mid-thought and left it as a token. The glove was strikingly clean, almost too much so for a village whose lanes were thick with loam and leaf mulch. Miss Marple approached it with the sort of calm curiosity that had long unsettled the more excitable villagers. She examined the glove closely, her fingers careful not to disturb its angle. It was made of kid leather, finely stitched, with no initials but delicately perfumed. A faint scent of lavender, though tinged with something older, something like damp pages in a locked drawer. She turned slowly, her eyes drifting over the hedge, the sundial half obscured by a creeping vine, and the laurels near the back gate. Just then, a soft rustle came from behind the hedgerow. She paused. Not the wind, not an animal either, but something, or someone, had passed. She said nothing. Instead, she plucked the glove from its perch and carried it back to the house. Later that day, Edith Browning, the maid employed in Miss Marple's service for just over a year, entered the drawing room with uncharacteristic hesitation. She placed the silver tray down and stood for a moment, fidgeting with the corner of her apron. "I don't mean to alarm you, ma'am," she said at last, "but I saw someone last night." Miss Marple did not look up from her knitting. "Did you?" "A woman," Edith continued, "in white. Standing by the sundial. I saw her from the attic window, plain as day, or night, I suppose, pale and still, like she was listening for something. But when I went down, there was nothing." Miss Marple finally met her gaze. "Did you check the path?" Edith nodded. "No footprints. Not a one. And the grass was wet, ma'am. If anyone had been there, well, they would have left a sign." Miss Marple offered no alarm, no rebuke, only the smallest lift of her brow and a gentle murmur. "I see." By the following morning, the matter of the ghost in Miss Marple's garden had slipped quietly into the teacups and church pews of St. Mary Mead. As with most peculiarities in the village, it needed no invitation. Mrs. Duncombe mentioned it casually, while purchasing sardines at the grocer's. Reverend Phelps fielded it obliquely during his Wednesday sermon on spiritual visitation, and by the time the news reached the ears of Colonel Weatherby, it had grown to include a pale spectre, a blood-stained glove, and an unmarked grave beneath the lilac hedge. Miss Marple, for her part, made no attempt to suppress the rumors. She understood the utility of gossip. It was not merely a distraction in rural life, it was a form of collective memory, a way for the village to process what it did not yet understand. She listened with care, noting who embellished and who deflected, who leaned in and who looked away. Often the most revealing thing in a tale was not what was said, but who chose to say it at all. The glove remained in her bureau drawer, untouched and unspeaking. Among those now present in the village, some long-rooted, others freshly transplanted, Miss Marple took special note of three. There was Edith, of course, whose nerves had frayed ever so slightly since her encounter by the sundial. Then Major Fullerton, recently returned from a rather unsavory spell abroad, with a disposition as sharp as his collars, and a tendency to dismiss anything he could not measure with a ruler. And lastly, there was Cecily Vane. Elegant, composed, and far too self-contained to be simply a visitor. Miss Vane had taken up residence at Cranford Cottage 2 months prior. Her reason, she claimed, was scholarly, an interest in local architecture and rural customs. But Miss Marple suspected something less academic and rather more personal. She watched them all, quietly, and without judgment. It was not until evening that the next thread of strangeness revealed itself. Miss Marple had gone to the garden shed to retrieve a small trowel, more for comfort than utility, as the evenings had turned too chill for planting. As she opened the cedar drawer where she kept her twine, a slip of aged paper caught her eye. It was a photograph, creased at the corners, smelling faintly of mildew. The image was of a young woman, perhaps 20, standing near what looked very much like Miss Marple's own sundial. Her expression was unreadable, the sort that invited questions rather than answered them. Miss Marple turned the photograph over. No writing, no date, no explanation. She stood in silence, the photo resting lightly between her fingers. She had never seen this photograph before. And yet, there it was, placed where only she would find it, when no one had been. Or so she had thought. Cecily Vane, it was agreed in hushed conversations and lifted teacups, had the look of someone with a past, though not necessarily a troubled one. Her arrival at Cranford Cottage had stirred a modest flutter, as all new arrivals did. But it was her unassuming poise that kept the interest lingering longer than usual. She spoke with a refined gentleness, was immaculately dressed without the least appearance of vanity, and claimed a fondness for English domestic architecture, particularly of the Edwardian period. Miss Marple had met her once or twice, in settings both social and incidental. The young woman's curiosity seemed well-tempered, never pushy, never indiscreet. Yet it struck Miss Marple that her questions invariably returned to one subject: the former occupants of Cranford Cottage. She asked, delicately of course, whether any old letters had been preserved, or if the garden plans from the early 1900s were available at the local historical society. On one occasion she had even inquired whether Miss Marple had ever known of Veronica Elstone. Miss Marple had indeed known of Veronica. Everyone in St. Mary Mead had. A delicate creature with wistful eyes and a fondness for playing the piano at twilight, Veronica had vanished one late summer evening in 1912. A tragedy, they'd said. Presumed drowned while walking along the lower river path, though the body had never been found. The event over time had turned soft around the edges, until it resembled one of those sorrowful tales meant to be folded away in linen drawers with pressed flowers. And yet Cecily seemed intent on reopening the drawer, not with sensationalism but with something quieter, something determined. Miss Marple watched her with care, noting that her interest, while dressed in scholarly terms, was driven by a deeper impulse. Personal, perhaps. Emotional, certainly. It was nearly a week after the incident of the glove when Edith Browning again appeared, somewhat pale around the temples and visibly discomposed. She took to treading carefully in the garden, especially in the dusk hours, avoiding the path near the sundial. When questioned, she offered a hesitant explanation, only half believed even by herself. "I heard crying, miss," she said. "Not sobbing exactly, just weeping. Soft, like it came from beneath the earth." Miss Marple did not chastise her for fancifulness, nor did she reassure her with the empty comfort that such things were impossible. Instead, she merely asked when it occurred. "Twice now," Edith whispered. "First near the lavender beds and then by the cracked bench. The crying stopped each time just before I reached it. But the smell remained." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Lavender?" "Yes, ma'am. stronger than usual, and not like the flowers we grow. It was older, faded. There was no wind that evening, and yet a window pane rattled softly upstairs. Miss Marple said nothing of it, but she retrieved the white glove from its resting place in her bureau and held it to her nose. The same scent, faint, persistent, and no longer merely floral. There is, in every village, a place that holds memory more tightly than others. A gate where lovers once parted, a church pew where scandal brewed, or in this case, a cracked marble bench half swallowed by ivy. Miss Marple had not sat upon it in years, though it had once been the favorite perch of Veronica Elstone. As she stood before it now, her mind wandered back to the songs Veronica used to hum, the delicate laugh that drifted through the hedgerows in the golden hours before supper. As Cecily Vane, she noted, had passed by this very bench more than once in recent days, pausing thoughtfully each time. There was nothing overtly suspicious in the act, yet Miss Marple observed that she always glanced, just briefly, towards the sundial before moving on. It was a habit, perhaps unconscious, but habits were telling things. The bench, once white, was now veined with moss. Yet when Miss Marple ran her gloved fingers across its side, she felt the shallow groove of initials, V.E., long since worn smooth by rain and time. There was something sorrowful in the way the ivy clung to the stone, as though nature itself resisted letting go of what had once happened there. And as the dusk gathered once more, Miss Marple found herself wondering, was Cecily seeking closure or confirmation? Major Fullerton was not a man given to indulgence in the dramatic, the supernatural, or the faintly suggestive. His manner was as straight as his parting, and he had once declared to Miss Hartnell, during a particularly foggy Christmas, that anyone who believed in spirits, except the kind one poured, ought to be examined by a military doctor. And yet of late he had begun to show signs of disquiet, not in any overt sense, but in his persistent irritation at any mention of Cecily Vane. He dismissed her inquiries as snooping, her historical interest as fishing in muddy waters, and her temperament as too still to be trusted. It was an unusual degree of opinion from a man otherwise inclined to boredom over village gossip. Miss Marple noted this change without comment, as was her way. She had known Major Fullerton since his early return to the village following a brief and quiet scandal involving an unfortunate posting in Bengal. Since then, he had lived alone with a dog and a daily regimen of walks and whiskey, never involving himself in affairs beyond the parish council. Yet the tension in his voice, whenever Cecily's name arose, hinted at something buried. Not unlike the history Miss Vane herself seemed intent upon unearthing. Miss Marple pondered this over her embroidery, thread looping calmly through linen, though her mind followed lines not jotted on any sampler. It was an errand of minor importance that sent Mr. Dodds, the village mechanic, to inspect the motor car Miss Vane had hired from the agency in Much Benham. A rattle in the axle. Nothing more. And the matter would likely have passed without note, had he not opened the glove compartment in search of the registration papers. Inside, amid a packet of barley sweets and a folded receipt from the Red Lion, he found a torn scrap of photographic paper. Unremarkable to the untrained eye, yet to Mr. Dodds, who prided himself on tidiness, it seemed oddly familiar. When the piece reached Miss Marple, as eventually all things did, she received it with the gentlest of smiles, and placed it alongside the photograph she had found days earlier in her garden shed. The match was precise, the corners tear aligned perfectly with the lower edge of the image, a fragment restored. What intrigued her more than the fact of its existence was its location. Why should a fragment of a long-lost photograph seemingly forgotten and water-stained, reside within the motor car of a woman who claimed no connection to Veronica Elstone? Miss Marple turned the reunited image in her hands once more. The sundial in the background, the expression on the girl's face, still blurred, still unreadable, seemed now more deliberate than accidental. The photograph had not drifted. It had been placed. Mrs. Bantry, whose conversational meanderings were often more revealing than she realized, shared a curious recollection over her second cup of Ceylon at Miss Marple's table. "It's the most extraordinary thing," she said, buttering a crumpet. "But I had quite forgotten that Veronica Elstone was engaged. Briefly, of course. Youthful nonsense." He broke it off before the banns were read. Miss Marple looked up with mild interest. "Oh. And who was the fortunate gentleman?" "Oh, someone dreadfully dull. A solicitor, I think. Moved back to the village after the war. Lives near the church, keeps to himself. Harold Kingsley, that's the name." The name settled into the silence like a pin dropped onto velvet. Miss Marple said nothing. Her expression remained unchanged, but her fingers paused for a fraction of a second over the teapot. She poured slowly and precisely, as if the weight of the words required a steadier rhythm. Some ghosts, she thought, did not float through walls or glide under moonlight. Some ghosts wore shoes, paid taxes, and lived just beyond the hedgerow. It was the sort of death that did not stir alarm at first. Harold Kingsley had lived a methodical life, retired from legal work nearly a decade earlier, and was not known for any particular excess or indulgence. His maid, a woman of discreet habits and sparse imagination, found him seated in his usual armchair one mild afternoon, spectacles still perched on the bridge of his nose, and a tea tray laid neatly beside him. At a glance, he seemed asleep. Only the stillness was too complete, the silence too final. Dr. Letchworth, summoned with promptness and efficiency, declared it a heart seizure. Entirely natural at his age. There was no cause for suspicion, no untoward signs. And yet Miss Marple, who heard of the death via a casual remark from the greengrocer, paused just a moment longer than expected. She remembered Mrs. Bantry's mention of Harold Kingsley only days earlier. Once engaged to Veronica Elstone, he had returned to the village years after her disappearance, and lived in careful obscurity. There had been no scandal, no suggestion of impropriety, only a lingering sense that something between them had never fully been resolved. Miss Marple made no declarations, no inquiries, but she found herself wondering, as she stirred her tea and allowed her knitting to idle in her lap, whether a man who had so diligently avoided attention in life might be trying, at last, to avoid something even in death. It was not fear that troubled her, but timing. And timing, in Miss Marple's experience, was seldom coincidental. It was an idle visit, or so it appeared. Miss Marple had, over many years, perfected the art of appearing merely neighborly, whilst collecting the details others overlooked. When she paid her respects at Kingsley's cottage, there was no interrogation, no pressing. She listened to the maid recount the finding of the body, nodded at the mention of the tea tray, and accepted a brief tour of the study before quietly excusing herself. But in that brief inspection she had noted two things. The first was the untouched plate of biscuits, ginger, his usual preference, set beside the cup. The second was the faint scent that clung to the teacup itself. It was not floral, nor medicinal. It was bitter, elusive, and unmistakable to one who knew the signs. A trace of almonds, faint, almost ghostly. The sort of scent one would miss entirely, if one were not trained to notice subtleties. Miss Marple left the cottage with her expression as mild as ever, but her thoughts sharpened. bitter almonds did not belong in afternoon tea. By the following morning, the matter of Harold Kingsley's death had begun to lose its novelty, and talk returned to gardens, church renovations, and the latest unfortunate pairing in the village choir. But Miss Marple, in her quiet way, gathered more from silences than from speech. At the post office, it was mentioned that Kingsley had received a letter the week before. Unusual, as he seldom corresponded. The envelope, according to Miss Green, the postmistress, had been addressed in a tidy but unfamiliar hand, and had arrived bearing the London stamp. The contents of the letter were not known, of course, but the timing coincided too neatly with his sudden change in demeanor, noticed by Mrs. Cribbins, his housekeeper's cousin, who had seen him at the chemist's, with a look she described as unsettled. It was Mr. Hawthorne, the bookseller, who confirmed the final thread. Kingsley had mentioned, almost in passing, something about being dredged up again. The phrase had meant little at the time, but now, as Miss Marple turned the words over in her mind, they rang with more gravity. Dredged up, a past not forgotten, only buried. Veronica Elstone's name had returned to the village in whispered tones, and Harold Kingsley, who had once vowed silence, had received a letter, one that perhaps had spoken too much. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the solicitor's widow, and therefore a woman privy to a particular sort of village truth, who first mentioned the will. She did so not with impropriety, but with the restrained solemnity of one used to legal matters whispered behind damask curtains. Harold Kingsley, it appeared, had altered his will some 6 months before his death. The change had surprised even Mr. Ablewhite, the solicitor who had handled the affair with professional discretion. The bulk of the estate, modest though it was, had not been left to any surviving relation, nor to charitable causes, as might have been expected from a man without wife or child. Instead, the inheritance had been directed to an individual listed only by initials, V.E. The initials had drawn little attention at the time. But now, as gossip turned towards Veronica Elstone once more, their meaning began to settle in the minds of those who remembered. Miss Marple said nothing, but she felt the threads tightening. A bequest to the dead, or to someone very much alive, someone who had returned under another name, not seeking money, but something far more elusive, redemption, or perhaps revenge. The detail emerged by way of young George Sims, a coroner's assistant whose loyalty to discretion was equal only to his admiration for Miss Marple's wisdom. Over a quiet word in the churchyard, he revealed what had been troubling him since the inquest. "Didn't seem worth noting, ma'am," he said almost apologetically. But just before the doctor arrived, Mr. Kingsley stirred a little. Not much, mind. And he said something. Just one word, barely breathed. Miss Marple inclined her head, her manner attentive but not urgent. "Veronica?" he said softly. That was it. Clear as anything, then nothing. Miss Marple offered no outward reaction, but within, something shifted. A man's final word, often meaningless, sometimes profound, was, in this case, a whisper from the grave, or toward it. And if Veronica's name had been the last on his lips, perhaps she had never left his conscience at all. It was not by accident that Miss Marple returned to the sundial. Her earlier observations of Cecily Vane's glances, of the coded notations on the torn photograph, had formed an impression in her mind, delicate but insistent. Kneeling at its base, she examined the weathered stone more closely. Time and ivy had done their work, but one edge appeared less settled than the others, a faint ridge where the mortar seemed newer. It was not a grand concealment, merely clever and long forgotten. With a small effort and the aid of a rusted trowel, She eased the stone aside. Beneath it rested a box no larger than a hymn book. Its hinges had long since surrendered to rust, but it opened with surprising ease. Inside lay 3 objects: a dried sprig of lavender, pressed and brittle, a small silver locket, tarnished but still bearing the faint engraving of a date, 1912, and a torn photograph, the same as before, now revealed in its entirety. Miss Marple closed the box with care. The sundial, after all, marked time. But sometimes it seemed could not be buried, only hidden. The admission came not with drama but with the quiet intensity of someone long accustomed to silence. Cecily Vane, in a moment of unusual directness, disclosed her lineage to Miss Marple, not as an idle point of interest, but as a truth she could carry no longer in shadow. She was Veronica Elstone's niece, the daughter of Veronica's younger sister, an aunt she had never met but whose absence had echoed throughout her upbringing. The family had not spoken openly of the matter, only referred to it as a tragedy best forgotten. But Cecily, possessed of a temperament that did not favor loose ends, had begun to trace the outlines of a story that had never quite settled into rest. She did not believe, as the family insisted, that Veronica had drowned in a simple accident. The inconsistencies, whispers of a quarrel, the missing body, the abrupt silence from a man who had once loved her, had lingered like a draught beneath a locked door. Cecily had come to St. Marymead under a different name, not to deceive but to observe freely without the weight of familial expectation. Miss Marple listened with the gentlest attentiveness. She asked no immediate questions, but within her mind, a delicate realignment began. Blood, after all, called to blood, even through fog and time. The story emerged from the most unlikely of sources: a gardener named Rudge, who had once worked briefly at Cranford Cottage. He was not a man given to fancies, though his memory operated with curious selectivity, recalling dates by weather patterns and scents rather than calendars. It was during a polite inquiry into the age of the lilac hedges that Miss Marple guided the conversation toward the ground's earlier history. Mr. Rudge, prompted by little more than a passing reference to the old apple tree that had since been removed, recalled something odd he had dug up many years before. A doll, he said, wrapped in silk and buried quite purposefully. Not in a toy chest or box, but beneath the roots near the cracked marble bench. The memory had struck him as peculiar at the time, but no one had asked questions, and he had thought no more of it. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A doll buried in silk was no ordinary child's prank. It had the feel of ceremony, or concealment, and in such concealment sometimes lay the outlines of a truth others wished never to see daylight again. Miss Marple, who believed firmly in the persuasive power of a proper tea service, arranged to take luncheon with Mrs. Gillyflower, an elderly woman whose mind wandered slightly, but whose memories, when reached gently, bore remarkable clarity. Over lightly buttered toast and a modest egg salad, Miss Marple inquired after the old days at Cranford Cottage. Mrs. Gillyflower had once been a housemaid there, though only for a short period before the Elstones let the property. It was during the course of their second cup of Darjeeling that the conversation drifted, with careful guidance, to Veronica Elstone. At first, Mrs. Gillyflower offered only vague compliments. Delicate features, a musical laugh, the sort of recollections that floated safely above any deeper current. But as Miss Marple delicately mentioned the date of Veronica's disappearance, the older woman's eyes shifted slightly, and a pause fell between sips. "There was a man," she said at last, "came round the back one evening, the week before. Looked as though he didn't wish to be seen. Tall, dark overcoat, glancing over his shoulder like he'd something to hide." She did not know his name, but she remembered the shoes. Polished, legal-looking, as she put it. Not a farm sort. Miss Marple merely nodded, but her thoughts gathered quickly. Legal-looking shoes. A man in the shadows. A week before, a girl vanished without trace. It was a few days later, in the quiet sanctuary of the vicarage parlor, that Mrs. Gillyflower, perhaps emboldened by the earlier conversation, chose to share what she had long kept folded within her memory. On the very night Veronica had vanished, she had been late in returning from her cousin's cottage, and had passed by Cranford's rear path, just as the moon crested above the hedge. It was then that she heard voices, raised but not shouting, a man and a woman, urgent, distressed. She had paused, concealed by habit rather than intent, and listened. The man was pleading, the woman insisting. She caught only fragments, words like, promise, child, don't trust you. Then the sharpness of silence. Emerging from the side gate was a man she recognized then, and still recalled now, Harold Kingsley. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He looked about as if searching for something, or ensuring he had not been seen. Mrs. Gillyflower had not spoken of it before. "It wasn't my place," she murmured, "and there was never proof." But Miss Marple knew that in villages such as theirs, truth often came not in thunderclaps, but in murmurs half heard beneath the hedgerows. The photograph, once an enigma, now yielded to closer scrutiny. Miss Marple, whose eye for detail had served her through decades of village drama and human frailty, studied the reverse side once more. Amid the fading ink and brittle creases was a small series of notations, barely legible letters and numbers, curiously arranged. At first glance it resembled nothing more than the careless scribble of a forgotten hand. But memory, in Miss Marple's experience, had its own topography. She compared the marks to the layout of her own garden. Paths, hedges, the sundial's placement in relation to the lilacs and the old plum tree. And slowly, a pattern emerged. The figures aligned not with geography, but with memory. A location marked not by compass points, but by association. The markings led precisely to the base of the sundial, long overgrown with ivy. A place easy to overlook, even in one's own domain. But something had been placed there long ago, deliberately, and with hope that it would not be found, except by someone who knew how to look. Miss Marple folded the photograph and placed it gently beside her teacup. It was no longer just an image. It was a map drawn by grief and by guilt. The following night brought with it a hush that was deeper than usual, the kind that presses against the walls like an old secret-seeking air. Miss Marple, not given to fretfulness, nevertheless left her window ajar, not to invite disturbance, but to listen. Silence, she had found, was never truly empty. It rustled and breathed and betrayed far more than noise. Just after the clock in the vicarage struck 1, her soft, deliberate movement stirred the ivy near the sundial. No words, no footsteps on the path, only the faint scraping of stone. The sound ceased as quickly as it had come. Whoever had entered had fled before being seen, but not before leaving something behind. In the morning Miss Marple rose with her usual composure, and as she approached the sundial, her eyes were drawn to a single item resting just beneath the ivy. A white glove, soft and slender, dusted with soil along the fingertips. Not the first glove, and she suspected not the last. She picked it up gently. Someone, it seemed, was trying to dig up the past, and the garden was beginning to remember. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to involve others unnecessarily, but certain undertakings required the presence, not so much of strength but of formality. And so, with the quiet diplomacy honed through decades of church fates and moral puzzles, she invited 2 men to join her. The Reverend Phelps, ever mild and accommodating, and Major Fullerton, ever skeptical and grim. Neither knew precisely what they were to uncover, though the Major had muttered his disapproval from the outset. "Her garden is no place for digging at night," he had grumbled. "It invites scandal and earthworms." But Miss Marple had only offered him her mildest smile, the one that so often preceded truth. By dawn the ivy had been gently pulled aside, and the base of the sundial laid bare. Miss Marple pointed to a faint groove in the mortar, a subtle irregularity, the sort one would overlook unless one was very much looking. With the assistance of the vicar's spade and the Major's reluctant elbow, the stone was lifted. What lay beneath was no treasure, no chest of gold, but something far more valuable to Miss Marple's sensibility. A modest weathered box, carefully placed and long concealed. The vicar crossed himself. The Major muttered. Miss Marple said nothing, but in her silence, the ground itself seemed to hold its breath. The box, once lifted, crumbled at its edges. Age had reduced it to softness, its hinges rusted, its wood flaking like dried petals. But the contents, preserved by some miracle of concealment and construction, remained intact. First a monogrammed handkerchief, delicate linen, once white, now yellowed with time. Embroidered at one corner in faint blue thread were the initials V.E. Miss Marple pressed it gently between her fingers, as one might handle a relic. Next a fragment of bone, not large, not gruesome, but undeniably human. A knuckle perhaps, or the curve of a wrist. The vicar paled slightly, and even the Major was momentarily quiet. And then, folded with the precision of someone who had taken great care, a letter, ink faded, the paper brittle, sealed not in wax, but with the impression of a tear. Miss Marple opened it without ceremony. There was reverence in her touch, not hesitation. The words inside had waited long enough. The box was closed, the soil beside it neatly returned. The sundial would cover the place once more, as it always had. But what had been hidden was hidden no longer. Truth, after all, was not so easily buried, not here, not beneath her garden. The handwriting was elegant, slanted with care, the sort of penmanship taught in finishing schools and remembered in love letters. The words began plainly, "To whom it may concern, or who may still care." Veronica Elstone's voice, preserved in ink, was neither frantic nor sentimental. It was precise, as though she had rehearsed the lines in her mind before ever setting pen to paper. She wrote of fear, not the sudden kind, but the creeping sort that arrives in glances and lingers in silences. She spoke of a man who had once been her fiancé, whose affection had grown colder, whose ambition had sharpened into secrecy. There had been whispers, accusations unspoken, and finally, the truth, that he had fathered a child with another woman, one he intended never to claim publicly. Veronica, who had discovered the affair through letters never meant for her, had threatened to expose him, not out of vengeance, but because she believed the child deserved better. Her words turned somber as she described a final meeting, arranged beneath the sundial, to which she had gone with hope, but also with dread. She feared not violence, but erasure. "If I disappear," she wrote, "let someone remember I did not go willingly." Miss Marple folded the letter with a gravity that spoke for them all. The voice on the page had waited long for justice. Now perhaps it would be heard. Miss Marple did not speak immediately. She allowed the silence to settle first, thick with memory, and the weight of something finally unearthed. It was not difficult now to see the shape of it. Harold Kingsley, respected, retired, reserved, had lived among them not as a man content with age, but as one slowly crushed beneath the burden of what he had buried. His silence had not been stoic, but strategic. A life spent hiding the truth had formed him into the very image of reliability. A man no one would suspect because he left nothing out of place. But gardens, remember? So do photographs. And so, above all, does guilt. Miss Marple turned to the sundial once more, its face unchanged, its time eternal. She imagined Veronica standing there, perhaps hopeful, perhaps certain. A young woman silenced, not by time or distance, but by cowardice. Her letter never posted, a name left off every document. Yet now, the silence had been broken, and beneath the sundial, justice had quietly taken root. Miss Marple, having arranged the letter, the handkerchief, and the remains with due care, returned to her parlor not to rest, but to reflect. The pieces, glove, photograph, perfume, had not arrived at random, nor had they belonged solely to the dead. Each bore the quiet fingerprint of the living. Cecily Vane, whose poise concealed grief like lace covers old furniture, had not come simply to ask questions. She had come to unsettle the earth beneath the village's feet, an act that required no shovel, only suggestion. The glove draped on the hedge, the photograph placed just so, the unmistakable scent of lavender echoing a girl long gone. All had been chosen, not to haunt, but to provoke memory, to nudge conscience. She had not sought revenge. Cecily had never uttered an accusation. Instead, she had guided others, especially one man, toward the precipice of his own guilt. Kingsley, respectable and composed, had watched the past rise like mist from the ground, and found he could not breathe. Miss Marple understood. It was a clever thing to disturb not the peace, but the silence that pretended to be peace, and Cecily had done so with grace and without spectacle. The glove was not a ghost's. It was an invitation to confession. By the time Miss Marple visited Cranford Cottage again, the door had been left ajar, and the rooms lay in that particular stillness known only to places recently vacated. Cecily was gone. There had been no farewell, no announcement at the station, no calls upon the vicar. Only a single note placed on the table in the drawing room, written in the same fine script as the photograph's inscription. The ghost is buried. Let her rest now. There was no signature. Miss Marple folded the note and tucked it into her pocket. No police would be summoned. No grand scandal would erupt across St. Mary Mead. But a truth had surfaced, quietly and completely. And though the past remained what it was, it had now been spoken aloud, if only in fragments. The sundial stood where it always had, but the garden at last had released its secret. Mrs. Bantry's garden tea was, as ever, a carefully cultivated affair. The silver gleamed, the geraniums nodded in their terracotta ranks, and the buttered seed cake was sliced with dignified precision. But today, the conversation, though soft in volume, held an intensity more suited to thunder than sunshine. Miss Marple, seated in her usual wicker chair, neither raised her voice nor altered her inflection. Yet every ear turned when she began to speak. She spoke not with drama, but with an authority earned over years of watching, listening, remembering. She began not with accusation but with gratitude. For Mrs. Bantry's hospitality, for the garden's tranquility. Then with the gentlest transition, she moved to the matter of the past, of photographs and gloves, of laughter that had once filled Cranford Cottage, and of a disappearance that had never truly left the village. No one interrupted her. No one needed to. There was no performance, only unveiling. One petal at a time the story opened, and its scent was unmistakable. By the time she reached the moment where the sundial had yielded its secret, The teacup sat cooling, untouched. The village listened not as gossips, but as witnesses. The truth, she told them, had not been lost. It had simply been waiting. With delicate care, Miss Marple unfolded the identity of Cecily Vane. She spoke of the girl's lineage, not merely as Veronica Elstone's niece, but as her emotional heir. A child raised beneath the shadow of a name never spoken, of a grief never mourned aloud. Cecily had come not to confront, but to complete. She had brought no accusations, issued no threats. Instead, she had used symbols, objects that stirred recognition without explanation. The glove, draped so carefully. The photograph, placed where only one person might find it. The scent of lavender, elusive and unmistakable, once worn by a girl who had vanished in silence. It had not been theatrics. It had been strategy of the most human kind, a quiet reawakening of memory, of guilt, of conscience. She had forced no one to speak, but she had left space where the truth might grow, like a bulb left sleeping beneath the soil. Miss Marple explained how the garden itself had played its part, not merely as a setting, but as a silent witness. And in drawing attention back to it, Cecily had guided the village, and one man in particular, toward a reckoning, long postponed. Cecily had not needed to stay. Her task had been completed the moment guilt could no longer hide behind age or respectability. Of Major Fullerton, Miss Marple spoke with a clarity that surprised even the Major himself. His belligerence, his gruff dismissal of ghost stories and speculation, had struck many as arrogance. But beneath the bristles and bark lay something far quieter: regret. He had known Veronica Elstone, not intimately, but enough to recognize the change in her during those final weeks. He had suspected something was wrong, had even warned her, in his own halting way, not to meet with Kingsley again. But Veronica had smiled, thanked him, and said it would all be resolved soon. He had said nothing more, and when she disappeared he had chosen silence, afraid his knowledge would be misread as complicity. That cowardice, minor though it seemed, had lived in him like a sliver under the skin. Miss Marple absolved him gently, not with words of comfort but with fact. He had not been the cause of the tragedy. His sin, if it could be called one, was that he had tried, and failed, to prevent what came next. And so, his name, long muttered in suspicion, was at last set aside. Some guilt, she reminded them, is not born of wrongdoing, but of powerlessness. Harold Kingsley had confessed nothing in life. He had spoken no admission, penned no farewell. And yet, Miss Marple insisted, his guilt had revealed itself in every carefully arranged aspect of his final years. The will, rewritten to favor initials that no one had mentioned in decades. The sudden deterioration of health without clear cause. The faint almond scent in his teacup, dismissed as nothing by some but unmistakable to those who knew its origin. Even his final word, Veronica, spoken into the hush of death like a name long resisted. Miss Marple explained how guilt, when repressed long enough, found ways to surface. In the repetition of routines, in the slight tremble when certain names were mentioned, in the weight of a silence held too long. And then there were the objects: glove, photograph, scent. Each one symbolic, each one not of Cecily's design alone, but of Kingsley's torment. For it was not Cecily who had placed the glove in the sundial's ivy, or returned to the garden in the middle of the night. It was the man himself, his guilt haunting him, long before any ghost might try. Sometimes, Miss Marple said, the dead do not speak, but the guilty always do. Miss Marple spoke then not of people, but of place, of how gardens, though tended and trimmed, remember things that human beings choose to forget. The soil holds memory, she said. Of footsteps once hurried, of tears once shed, of promises once whispered beneath moonlight. The sundial had not moved, its shadow marked time, indifferent to sorrow. And yet, it had stood above a truth, long buried, waiting not for discovery, but for acknowledgement. Gardens, she reminded them, often contain more than vegetables and roses. They hold sentiment, secrets, silences that have grown roots. What had been unearthed was not just a box, not merely evidence. It was the final piece of a story that had never been fully told. And now that it had been, the garden would not forget, even if the villagers did. It would go on blooming, season after season, over a patch of ground where a girl's final thoughts had once been placed in ink and sealed with hope. Justice, Miss Marple concluded, does not always come loudly. Sometimes it is as quiet as a leaf turning in wind, but when it comes, it does not forget. As the gathering dispersed with subdued murmurs and cooling teacups, Miss Marple lingered near the sundial. The garden, so recently a tableau of revelation, now hummed softly with bees and the distant clatter of a tea trolley being wheeled back into the house. A crow, dark and stately, descended from a nearby branch and settled upon the sundial, its wings folding with a deliberate grace. It tilted its head as if observing. Miss Marple, watching the bird, smiled faintly. "There you are," she murmured, "right on time." The others had returned to their routines, Mrs. Bantry to her cushions, the vicar to his sermon notes, Major Fullerton to his solitary walk. But Miss Marple remained, her thoughts as steady as the stones beneath her. And then, with the gentlest of tones, she said it, half to herself, half to the wind. "The dead," she whispered, "have a way of finding their way home." The crow did not move. The sundial cast its long shadow, and the garden, having given up its story, returned to silence once more. But it was not the same silence as before. It was the kind that comes only after the truth has spoken. Cranford Cottage, once again without occupant, stood with the quiet pride of an old house that had outlasted its own stories. Its shutters, drawn but not latched, gave the impression of repose rather than abandonment. And though the rooms within were still, the garden had taken on a liveliness that defied the silence. Veronica's favorite blooms, sweet peas, forget-me-nots, and a scatter of cornflowers, had begun to flower in modest clusters along the borders. It was not an accident. Someone had sown them, quietly and with intent. Miss Marple, whose eyes noticed more than most, had seen the seed packets on the sill weeks before Cecily's departure. The girl had never mentioned them. She had simply planted and left. The garden had responded as all things do, when treated with care and memory. The air was subtly perfumed now, with old scents remembered anew. And the soil, once concealing, now seemed to breathe more freely, as though it too had been released from a long-held burden. Miss Marple passed the gate slowly one morning, her step unhurried, her eyes catching the slightest flicker of color in a new row of foxgloves. There was no ghost now, only memory. And sometimes, she thought, that was enough. A few days later, over a fresh pot of Darjeeling and a particularly well-made seed cake, Mrs. Bantry leaned across the tea table with that air of spirited curiosity she never quite managed to conceal. "I do wonder, Jane," she said, "why people go to such lengths to hide things, especially when the truth so often finds its own way out." Miss Marple, stirring her tea with a practiced elegance, offered no immediate reply. She allowed the thought to settle, as one might allow jam to steep properly in a Victoria sponge. "At first," she said at last, "it is because truth is inconvenient, then later because it is dangerous. But in the end it is because it has grown too heavy to carry, yet too old to explain. Mrs. Bantry nodded sagely, though whether in understanding or admiration, it was difficult to say. The tea was excellent, and the silence that followed was of the companionable kind that only comes after the solving of a long and sorrowful puzzle. Miss Marple glanced toward the garden. The clematis was climbing again, unhindered now by shadow. "There is a time for concealment," she added softly. "But eventually, even secrets bloom." And the seed cake, it must be said, was the finest she tasted that month. A week later, Reverend Phelps held a quiet blessing in the garden. It was not announced nor formalized. No notices were posted. Yet those who mattered knew, and those who had remembered came. Beneath the sundial, cleaned now and gently restored, a small plaque had been placed. It bore no flourish, no dates of birth or death, only these words: "In memory of Veronica Elstone, beloved and believed." There was no fanfare, just a few murmured prayers, a shared glance between old friends, and a moment of true silence, not awkward or forced, but solemn, as though the garden itself had paused in recognition. Miss Marple stood a little apart from the others, her gloved hands lightly clasped. The sundial cast a long shadow across the path, but it felt less severe than before, more honest. For years the garden had been beautiful. Now it was also kind. As the villagers departed one by one, Miss Marple lingered. She did not weep. There was nothing in her face to suggest tragedy, only a quiet satisfaction that some truths, however late in blooming, had taken root in the proper soil. And as she turned to leave, the sundial, steady in its stillness, marked not just time, it marked peace. In the days that followed the quiet dedication beneath the sundial, St. Mary Mead returned, as it always did, to its rhythms. The women resumed their knitting circles. The vicar resumed his sermons. Even Mrs. Pemberton resumed her objections to the new postmaster's habit of chewing peppermint during morning deliveries. And yet something had subtly shifted, not outwardly perhaps, but in the tenor of glances exchanged across shop counters, in the way certain names were spoken less brusquely, more gently, as if an old ache had softened. The story of Veronica Elstone, like all village tragedies, began its slow transformation, from remembered sorrow to something half-forgotten, tinged with nostalgia, softened by time. People do not forget entirely, of course, but they begin to reframe, to forgive, to fold events into the tapestry of their shared mythologies. The garden, however, did not forget. Its memory was not woven from hearsay but from shadow and root. It remembered every footstep that had paused beneath the sundial, every voice lowered in urgency or fear. It remembered the tears that had fallen into its soil, the whisper of a name breathed too late. The garden did not speak, but it bore witness. And some truths, Miss Marple knew, prefer to be remembered in silence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hedgerows in quiet gold, Miss Marple took her usual walk home. Her pace was unhurried. The day, having offered its final gift of light, withdrew with dignity, and the first of the twilight birds called softly across the fields. She passed the churchyard, where the stones bore names older than any scandal. She nodded to Mr. Withers sweeping the porch of the village hall, and to young Angela Clegg, walking her dog with that exaggerated solemnity known only to girls determined to be seen as grown. The village greeted her not with awe, but with familiarity. For in truth most had only guessed at the fullness of what had passed, and that, Miss Marple thought, was as it should be. Some mysteries were meant for solving, others were meant for understanding, and some, those wrapped in human sorrow rather than criminal ambition, were meant for closing gently, like the gate at the end of a long path. She reached her cottage just as the breeze stirred the curtain. The kettle left ready would soon hum on the stove. There was no grand conclusion, no applause, only the quiet reward of having listened well, of having noticed, and of knowing, with a certainty as steady as the sundial shadow, that justice had taken root, softly, firmly, and forever. And so, beneath the quiet hedges of St. Mary Mead, another mystery has been laid to rest, not with noise or scandal, but with the hush of truth gently uncovered. What began as a single white glove placed in the garden became a path of remembrance, forgiveness, and quiet justice. Miss Marple, as always, saw not just what others missed, but what they dared not face. This was never simply a tale of murder. It was a story of memory. How deeply the past can root itself in the soil we walk upon, and how silence, when broken with care, can bring peace rather than pain. But it leaves us with a question worth pondering. If you were in Cecily's place, would you have tried to unearth the truth after so many years, knowing it might bring no formal justice, only personal closure? Or would you have let the past sleep beneath the sundial